This lecture is a review of theories and models or frameworks that you've learned throughout your health career at Towson University. These are all models that you should have learned, and we're going to talk about how you select a model for programming. These are some questions or ideas on how people select models. The first one is, how appropriate is the model to your population or program? You might have stakeholders that have a preference. Sometimes you're writing a grant and it says specifically, you must use this model. Sometimes you only have a limited amount of time for planning, and that might dictate what model you choose. Sometimes resources are limited. That might dictate some model selection. You also have to think about how involved your clients are as partners or just consumers. Sometimes the funding agency has a preference, and most of you have a personal level of comfort and knowledge with different models. So sometimes you're narrowing it down to 3 models, and there's one that you feel the most comfortable, and that's the one you choose. So these are the models we're going to consider through this lecture. They're not all of them, but it's a large number. The lecture is relatively long, but you can feel free to stop it at any time and come back and watch it later. So the first one is precede proceed, health belief model, then Fishbein's theory of reasoned action, theory of change, social cognitive, locus of control, theory of organizational change, problem behavior theory, diffusion theory, and socio-ecological model. So the first one on the list was precede proceed, and precede proceed, there's a whole lecture on that in a different slide presentation. But just briefly, for this model, when you're doing your planning of your program, you often look at predisposing, reinforcing, and enabling factors. And the reason you look at them is because you're trying to describe why behaviors occur. So if students in the middle school are not exercising every day, you would look at what factors, predisposing, reinforcing, and enabling, are causing the unhealthy behaviors, so you know which factors to try to address to increase the healthy behaviors. So if you think about your topics for the middle school health fair, you should be able to identify some predisposing, reinforcing, and enabling factors, and that should help you determine what it is you need to cover in order to address your topic. The next model, which is on the screen, is the health belief model. And in the health belief model to the left, you have the demographics of your population. And then in the center, you have a series of constructs that need to be addressed. And then on the right, it leads to behavior change. So you can look at these, and we'll talk briefly about each construct. And if you want more information, then you should do a little more research or reading in some of the materials that are provided in Blackboard. So perceived susceptibility relates to how susceptible your population thinks they are to a disease or a condition. So if, for example, you are working with middle school students and you're trying to teach them not to smoke because of lung cancer, you have to figure out how much they believe they're susceptible to lung cancer. And because of where they are in development, they don't have that long-term planning aspect. They're looking at very short-term, short ideas, things that happen a week or a month later. So if you're trying to teach them to not smoke because they're going to get lung cancer, that's likely to not work because they don't think they're susceptible to that disease because they're so young. However, they might be interested in wrinkles. They might be interested in smelling bad because those are more relevant to them. Perceived severity, you have to determine how severe they believe the situation is. So if you're talking about not exercising and you want them to exercise, you have to figure out how severe they think it is to not exercise. If they think it's really not that big of a deal, then it's going to be very hard to get them to exercise. Perceived benefits, you need to figure out what your population thinks is a perceived benefit. You might say, well, not smoking and exercising and eating healthy foods will make you feel better, and that's the benefit. But if your population does not see that as a benefit, then it's not a benefit to them. So a big challenge is for you to figure out what benefits they see so that you can teach them that those benefits do exist in the behavior change you want them to do. Then there are perceived barriers, and again, this is what your population thinks is a barrier. If your population thinks that services are not available, even if they are, that's their perception, that's their reality. You then have to address that perception in order to make behavior change happen. And the last construct there is perceived self-efficacy, and this was added later to this model. It was not part of the original model. And what it is it's looking at, do they believe that they can do what you want them to do? Do they believe they can exercise every day? Do they believe they can eat healthy foods? Do they believe they can quit smoking? The more likely they believe it, the more likely they are to do it. On the bottom of the screen, you should see cues to action, and those cues to action, that refers to the programming that you put into place that addresses these perceptions to lead to behavior change. So why would you use the health belief model? You'd use it if you're looking at perceptions and how they affect behavior, and if you're trying to address perceptions in order to change behavior. If you think about your topic and what your clients perceive, specifically middle school students and the college students, what are their perceived barriers, benefits, severity, susceptibility, and self-efficacy? You need to identify those items in order to choose appropriate activities or appropriate vendors. On the screen now is the theory of reasoned action, and in this theory, we have several items that are in play. The first one is you're looking at behavior change to the far right, and what we know is that if someone has an intention to perform a specific behavior, they're more likely to do the behavior. So if you ask someone, do you intend to quit smoking in the next 3 months, and they say yes, they are more likely to quit smoking than if the other person you ask, are you going to quit smoking in the next 3 months, and that person says no. So intention of behavior is an indication of what behavior might happen. Sometimes in this, when you're doing health education, you cannot see the behavior change. One example is if you're working with people to use condoms every time they have sex. It would be inappropriate to follow people around to see if they're using condoms. But if you ask them an intention question, like, do you intend to use condoms every time you have sex in the next 3 months? And they say yes, that's an indication they're more likely to do that behavior. Another part of the behavior in this model is looking at what normative beliefs are in the culture and what the beliefs and evaluations are of close, intimate friends. So if the friends believe you should use condoms all the time and the norm in the culture is you should use condoms all the time, your intention is more likely to be to use condoms and your behavior is more likely to use condoms. But if in your society or your group of people around you, the belief is that it's not important to wear condoms and the norms in your culture are that you should not wear condoms, it's not likely that you're going to intend to use condoms, and it's not likely that you will use condoms. So this looks at a whole bunch of different aspects that lead up to behavior change. So why might you use it, and what are you doing? You're looking at how behavioral intentions relate to behavior, and you often use it when you cannot measure the actual behavior. You also might use this model if you're looking at social norms or peer norms for your topic, and you cannot measure the behavior, but you can look at the norms of society or peers. The next model on the screen is the stages of change theory, and this has 6 different pieces to it, and I'm going to use myself as an example in the stages of change theory. So these are the 6 stages. In pre-contemplation, the person has no idea that whatever their behavior or health status is a problem. So if someone has high cholesterol and they don't think it's a problem, they're in pre-contemplation. They're not thinking about it at all. And so the example that I'm going to give you is an example that is about me and gaining weight, and I was never in pre-contemplation. I always knew that being obese was an issue. So somewhere around the time I was 40, I started gaining weight very quickly. I was gaining at least 5 pounds a month without any change in diet or exercise. So after I gained 100 pounds in 1 year, my doctor decides that maybe he should test me for thyroid condition. And I did have thyroid condition. So now I'm 100 pounds overweight, which means I'm morbidly obese. And contemplation, I know that's unhealthy and I know I need to fix it. And I think about it, but I don't do anything. And so in the contemplation phase or stage, the person knows there's a problem, but the person doesn't do anything about it. So that's contemplation. In the preparation phase, when we're talking about my situation, I knew I have to do something, and when I moved into the preparation phase, I started collecting items that I needed to lose weight. So I bought all kind of exercise videos. I have P90X, and I have the rubber bands, and I have CDs to do step aerobics. I have a step. So I have all these things I'm purchasing because I'm preparing to do something. But in the preparation phase, all people are doing is preparing. So as a health educator, I knew to lose weight, I had to eat healthy and had to exercise. And so I looked at all of the options. One of the options that I needed was a food plan. And I know that Weight Watchers works, and I know why it works, but I could not afford Weight Watchers because as a single parent with a teenager, I had no money. So I looked online for a variety of programs in my preparation stage, and I finally found one that was free that was very similar to Weight Watchers, where you kept track of all your activities and you kept track of all the food you ate. You could eat anything you wanted, but you only had so many calories a day. So if I wanted to eat French fries, I could, but maybe I couldn't have chocolate milk later. So you had to make choices in order how you got all of your nutrients. So after several months, maybe a year of preparing, I finally decided one day, this is it, I'm done. And so for exercise, I started out by walking my dogs at least 1 mile every day. And then I used that online program to help me keep track of what I was eating. And I lost a lot of weight very slowly, like you're supposed to. I lost 2 to 4 pounds a month. So that was my action phase. During maintenance phase, the person is trying to make a habit out of whatever the behavior is. And that usually takes 7 years. So 7 years of eating healthy and exercising. At that point, you're probably in maintenance and you don't need as much support. In termination, that occurs after 7 years, and that's when you can pull a program away and the person's behaviors stay in a healthy place. So why would you use stage of change theory? It's important if you're trying to figure out how close someone is to making a change. If someone is in pre-contemplation phase, their program is going to look very different than if someone's in preparation phase. And so that actually helps you develop a program that best fits your population. So for the middle school and for the Towson University, what is the stage that your population is in? You have to look at your topic, all the needs assessment data we've collected, and then try to figure out what stage is your population, and then what do you do to develop a program? What vendors match that? What topics or activities match that? And so that's how you would use stage of theory, stages of change. The next one on the screen now is social learning or social cognitive theory. And there are basic tenets to this theory, and that these are listed on the screen. The first is that behaviors can be shaped. And shaping means that you make small steps towards changing a big behavior. Rather than just saying, that's it, we're doing X, you make little tiny steps in order to get to X. And so that's what shaping is. Theorists in this area believe that people learn through personal experience and observation of others. If I watch someone get seriously injured and have a traumatic brain injury because they were not wearing a seatbelt, I can learn by observing that with them. I don't have to have a serious accident and traumatic brain injury to say, hey, maybe I should wear a seatbelt. So this you can learn through your personal experience, but you can also learn by observing what happens with other people. The next item, behaviors are learned and can be unlearned. So any bad health behavior that's learned or any unhealthy behavior that's learned can be unlearned. And that means you can teach people healthy behaviors in their place. And there's also a role that rewards play in increasing or decreasing behaviors. So this square you should have seen before, and it shows you across the top whether you're adding or subtracting from the environment, and to the left if you're increasing or decreasing behavior. So if you want to increase behavior and add to the environment, that is called positive reinforcement. So I'm going to use driving as an example. I might have to use something else for one of these, but I'll use driving for most of them. So if you want someone to drive well and you want to reward them by giving them something, that would be an example of positive reinforcement. And if you think about some of the commercials on TV, I think that it's Allstate that has the safe driving rebate. So if you have no accidents, you get a check in the mail. So they're adding money to the equation to encourage you to continue the good behavior. If you want to increase behavior and take away from the environment, that is called negative reinforcement. And so if you want to increase someone's good driving, you have to take something away. And an example of this is if someone drives well, they keep their license. But if they know you're going to take their license away if they don't drive well, then that would be an example of increasing behavior for fear of negative reinforcement. There's also a way to decrease behavior by either adding to the environment or by taking away from the environment. So in regards to punishment, it means I'm going to add to your driving issue to decrease your behavior. One thing that happens here is that if someone gets a speeding ticket, there are additional fees added to the picture. So if I speed, I get points, my insurance goes up, and I have to go to court. So that's an example of adding to the environment for punishment to decrease the behavior. And the last thing on here is extinction, and I'm going to switch to talking about pets. If you take something away from the environment and decrease behavior, that is called extinction. So if you have a dog who begs at the table every day and you feed him every day, when you stop feeding him or you stop giving him attention while he's begging, eventually the behavior will stop. It takes a lot of patience to make extinction work, but if you take reinforcement away to decrease behavior, it does work. An example in school setting is if someone misbehaves and you do not give them any attention whatsoever, eventually the behavior decreases. So to use this theory, you might be looking at reciprocal determinism, and that means for every action there's a reaction. And you might use this theory if you can address the environment, the people, and the behaviors. So when you're looking at your populations and topics for the health fair, are there specific causes or triggers for behavior, and can you alter those causes or triggers? That would help you address the environment, the people, and the behaviors. Locus of control is based on a couple different themes, and one is internal versus external locus of control. And that is you want people to have an internal locus of control, realizing that they control their behaviors. But oftentimes when you're starting, there needs to be an external locus of control because they have not internalized the rewards and beliefs that the behavior is healthy. And that gets me to reward schedules, because reward schedules are closely related to locus of control and changing behavior. So internal versus external of control we've talked about, but we're going to talk about fixed and variable reward schedules. So fixed and variable reward schedules, I'm going to use two different topics. The first will be gambling. You have to ask yourself why people keep gambling. So, and I'm talking specifically about the machines, not the different games that require critical thinking. So when someone sits down at a machine, why do they keep putting money into the machine even if that person is losing? And the reason is because there's a variable reward structure. That person never knows when they're going to hit. If the machine went off every 100th time, people would count all the times, and once they got, like say somebody left at 75, they'd say, okay, in 25 times I'm going to get a reward. But that's not how those machines work. They're set to be variable schedules. And so because the person never knows when they're going to get the reward, the behavior continues. They keep putting money in the machine. In a fixed variable reward structure, the person gets a reward every so often or every time. So when you're beginning a health program, you may need to give a fixed reward schedule in order to get people to come. So every time they come to an event, they get a reward. But gradually you would want to switch to a variable reward schedule, because then they don't know when they're getting a reward and they continue to come because this might be the time they get a reward. And those are also used at extinction of behaviors or initiating behaviors. The same is true. I'm going to talk about that dog begging at the table again. The fixed schedule would be that you feed the dog every single time he begs. If you do that, that would be a fixed reward. To extinguish that behavior, all you have to do is stop feeding the dog, and the dog knows it's over. I get a treat every day. I'm not getting treats anymore. I must not be getting treats. It's done. In a variable reward schedule, that would be where you sometimes feed your dog at the table and sometimes you don't. That is a much more difficult behavior to break because the dog does not know if this is a time that he or she is getting a treat. So they just keep coming back because sometimes they don't get treats. So if you don't give them a treat for 7 days, maybe that's just some of the times they're not going to get treats. So extinguishing behaviors that have been set up through a variable reward schedule is difficult. It's more difficult than a fixed schedule. And you should keep that in mind as you're planning health programs. So why do you do this? It's if you're looking at why people behave the way they do, and you can incorporate schedules of reinforcement. And you also have to be able to address people, environments, and reinforcing of behaviors. You have to look at whether or not your population has internal or external locus of control and whether or not you can actually address those. So the next model on the screen is theory of organizational change. And in this theory, you're looking at changing an organization. And I'm going to specifically talk about smoking and tobacco usage. So when I started college in the 70s, people were allowed to smoke in classrooms. Then around my second or third year in college, you could only smoke in a classroom as long as no one complained. Well, because 75% of the population smoked, the 25% of us who did not, we did not feel comfortable saying, hey, don't smoke. So unless the teacher said, we're not smoking in this class, people still smoked in the classes. The reason I'm using that is because of where we are today. Today, there's no tobacco or any kind of smoking material or chewing tobacco on campuses. That did not happen overnight. It took a series of steps or stages to get there. So the first stage is to identify the problem. What needs to be changed? You then need a plan on how to make that change, and you need to get buy-in from the supervisors of the organizations. So once it was decided people shouldn't be smoking on campus or they shouldn't be smoking in classrooms, the supervisors or the higher ups, the presidents and vice presidents, had to agree to that in order that you could implement the initiation stage. In the initiation stage, you're gathering support, whether it's from the people at the top or your peers. Once you have the support you need and policies are created, you then implement it, which means we went from not being able to smoke in classrooms to you could only smoke in classrooms if no one complained, to before I left college, you could not smoke at all in classrooms. And then by the time I was getting my master's degree, you could only smoke outside buildings. So there was a progression there that happened with the implementation. And then the key point here is after 7 years, typically that's when something becomes institutionalized and no longer needs a lot of attention. So it's a long time to make organizational changes. If you're working with an organization and you're trying to make a change for health behavior within an organization, you need to understand that it's going to take at least 7 years, up to 10. So whatever you're doing, if you're trying to alter the health behavior or unhealthy behavior in your organization, you have to look at this organizational change, because without organizational support, what you're trying to do will not last. The next one is the problem behavior theory, and it looks at relationships among personality, environment, and behaviors. You use this mostly when you're studying risky behaviors. It's been used most often with adolescents. and you use it when you're trying to see how these three elements, personality, environment, and behaviors, relate. So if you're working on an issue where you can relate personality, environment, and behaviors, and you can actually affect those and how they interrelate with each other, this could be a theory that you might want to consider. The next one on the screen is the diffusion theory, and diffusion looks at how ideas are diffused into a community. And a diffuser is what people buy when they put the sticks into a fragrance, and then the fragrance spreads through the room. The same is true when you're looking at ideas. There's a way to diffuse ideas into the population. One of the things to do is to understand the 20-80 rule. In the 20-80 rule, there's 20% of your population is responsible for 80% of the behaviors. So if you can get that 20% to buy into your healthy behavior change, they can then participate and encourage 80% behavior change. The other part of it is the tipping point. Once you get the right people involved and a certain number of people are doing your healthy behavior, the scales will tip into your favor of healthy behaviors. So it takes a lot of thought into this, how to diffuse into a community. You have to pick the right people to do what you want them to do. Just because someone has a leader title as a leader in the community does not mean they are the leader. Oftentimes, the true leaders in the community do not have official titles. They are people in the community that have gathered enough respect from the community members that whatever they do, the community does. So if you're focusing on how to change attitudes or behaviors in a community, diffusion theory might be something you would use. You have to be able to identify the most important or most influential 20% of the population, because that's who's going to help you change the behaviors. The last model we're going to look at is the social ecological model, and in this model you're looking at 5 different levels of behavior. It's the individual, then the intimate relationships that that person has with family and friends, the community in which the person lives, the institutions in that community like schools or churches, and then society in general. In the social ecological model, you need to address most or all of those elements in order to see behavior change. It's been very clear in research that if all you do is look at individual behavior and you do not address any of the other elements, your behavior change will not remain when the program ends. So it's critical that you look at more than one of these elements. The social ecological model, these are how to describe each of the different areas. The individual is the biological or personal history. The relationship is the close relationships that people have and that influence behaviors. The community is settings where relationships occur. The institution are the roles the institutions might play, and those include public policy, laws, or resource allocation, and oftentimes that occurs in those organizations like schools and churches. And the last item is societal factors that promote a specific climate or promote specific behaviors. So you might use the social ecological model if you're looking at how those complex items interplay with each other. You have to be addressing more than one area of risk, and you're trying to sustain prevention efforts over more than a single intervention. So again, if all you do is look at the individual, then more than likely your program will dissolve after you stop putting any kind of effort into it. So these are some other important issues to look at with a social ecological model. So just to go to end where we started, we started out by looking at how you select a model. I've shared with you some more of the most popular models that are used in health education. By no means is that all of the models. But you need to look at the appropriateness of the model to your population, preference of your stakeholders, how much time you have and how many resources you have, You have to figure out how involved your clients are. Are they partners, or are they only consumers? You have to look if your funding agency has a preference, and you have to look at your personal comfort and knowledge level of different models. So that concludes the lecture on models and theories. You should be able to use that to help you planning programs and in writing your final paper.